Hey everyone, welcome back to the Chronological Bible Study. This is video 37 that covers weeks 37 and 38, day 244 to day 258. We had about a 2-week interruption in our Bible study, so we're playing some catch up now, and we're getting back into our study of the Bible in chronological order. We're picking back up where we left off with video 35. Toward the end of that week, we discussed the differences between the Battle of Gog and Magog that is listed in Ezekiel 38 and 39 and the Battle of Gog and Magog that's referenced in Revelation 20. And remember, we said that the one from Ezekiel probably takes place earlier than the one in Revelation. That it's in fact two separate battles. The one in Ezekiel possibly taking place during the tribulation period, and the one in Revelation taking place after the millennial reign of Christ on earth, so after the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So the final where Satan's let loose and he goes and deceives all the nations being all the Gentiles, and there's this final battle of Gog and Magog. And remember, we discussed the differences between the two. Just a quick note, we want to apologize for any editing. My wife and I are not professional YouTubers. We don't make any money from this. We don't do this for money. This is just to help people understand their Bibles better, and our humble little addition to Bible study. So we're going to pick back up today with Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 28 and 30. Here's a summary of the captives taken from Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 597, 586, and 581. And if you remember back to video 35, I showed you on that book that shows the history of the world of those three little lines that went down and represented the 3 times that Nebuchadnezzar exiled people from Judah. And finally the last one is when they destroyed the temple and destroyed the city walls. Well, that actually took place in 597, 586, and 581. And here in Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 28, it says, "The number of captives taken to Babylon in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was 3,023. Then in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, he took 832 more. In Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year, he sent Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, and he took 745 more, and a total of 4,600 captives in all." So 4,600 captives went to Babylon. And remember, during that time when Nebuzaradan was the captain of the guard, was the time where he approached Jeremiah. Jeremiah was like, he asked Jeremiah that he could take him back to Babylon, and he could, make sure that he was taken care of there, because he was this prophet that was mistreated by his own people. Nebuchadnezzar valued him as a prophet, and he gave Jeremiah the choice of to go back to Babylon or to stay in Jerusalem, and he chose to stay behind in Judah. And then we know that during that time that he was in Judah, after the destruction of the temple, after the destruction of the city, he wrote the book of Lamentations, lamenting over the destruction of Jerusalem. So the first captivity took place in 597 BC, and there was an 11-year span to the next one that took place in 586 BC, and then there was another 5-year span between the second one and the third one. And so it was a total of 16 years, and each time he would go in, he would take some captives, and then he would set up a puppet king, and then that one would rebel, and he would go in and he'd do the same thing again. Well, finally the last time he just comes in and was like, okay, I'm going to take them all out. I'm taking their temple out. I'm relocating all these people. So right after that, in our chronological study, we have the genealogies of First Chronicles. And remember, when we were talking about this back in Exodus and Genesis, why genealogies were so important to the Jewish people. Well, the reason why it's so important for the Jewish people is that they want to prove that they have ownership of the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. So remember, in the Abrahamic covenant, they were promised land, right? And they were promised descendants. And this genealogy, proving that they descend from Abraham, was proof that they were partakers in that covenant where God had given them the land. So if they let that genealogy go, then they have no way to prove their ownership of the land. Also, they knew that the Messiah was supposed to come from the tribe of Judah, a descendant of David. All the genealogy that they used to track their lineage before the exile will then be needed to prove their lineage after the exile, to show that they truly do belong to the family of Jacob, that they're a descendant of Jacob, because now they've been taken out of that area, out of their tribal lands, and now they're returning. Well, they're going to have to kind of prove that they are true descendants of one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So we go through all these genealogies here, and we'll just talk about one real quickly, the birthright of Reuben. You'll notice in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 there it says, the oldest son of Israel was Reuben, but since he dishonored his father by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, his birthright was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. So remember, Joseph, he wasn't the youngest, because Benjamin was the youngest, but he was the one right above Benjamin. Joseph was. And remember, Joseph was the one that had went to Egypt and became second in power, only to Pharaoh. And he was the one that forgave his brothers for selling him into slavery and all that. And Reuben had lost his birthright as the oldest, and then that birthright was given to Joseph. It says, for this reason, Reuben is not listed in the genealogical records as the firstborn son. The descendants of Judah became the most powerful tribe and provided a ruler for the nation. But the birthright belonged to Joseph. So it's really interesting here. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 2, it says, the descendants of Judah became the most powerful tribe and provided a ruler for the nation. So we know that from previous prophecy that the Messiah was going to come from the tribe of Judah, although Joseph, which was the second to youngest brother, retained that birthright as the oldest son. And this goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 35. In Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, we see there that story, that occasion where Reuben laid with his father's wife. It says in verse 22, he says, while he was living there, Reuben had intercourse with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Jacob soon heard about it. And then it goes in and names the 12 sons and the mothers that they come from. Well, that gets picked up later on in Genesis 49. In Genesis 49, at the end of Jacob's life, he's giving blessings to all of his 12 sons. In verse 1, he says, then Jacob called together all his sons and said, gather around me, I will tell you what will happen to each of you in the days to come. Come and listen, you sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, the child of my vigorous youth. You are first in rank and first in power, but you are as unruly as a flood, and you will be first no longer. So remember, Reuben was the oldest son, and his birthright as the oldest had been given to Joseph, as we just discovered. And now this was all told by Jacob himself way back in Genesis 49, while they were in Egypt. It says, for you went to bed with my wife, you defiled my marriage couch. Then he goes on and talks about Simeon and Levi. Remember, Simeon and Levi were the ones that went in and slew that whole village because of the rape of their sister. Jacob tells them, he says, I'm going to scatter them among the descendants of Jacob, and I will disperse them throughout Israel. And we saw that happen with Levi. The tribe of Levi got dispersed. They never actually had any land of their own. They got dispersed through all the rest of the tribal land. And Simeon, the tribe of Simeon, only got a small little piece of land that was inside the land of Judah, that was contained inside of it. And then of Judah, he says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor. And that's where the beginning of that foretelling of the Messiah coming from Judah comes from there. He even talks about this one that's coming in his robes. He washes his clothes in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. So it's very similar to the language that's used in Revelation 19. Remember Dan, when they finally got settled in the promised land all those years later, they weren't happy with their allotted land, so they went and took some land from up north, and they relocated from down there in between Ephraim and Judah. They moved from there all the way up north. Then Benjamin Remember that Benjamin was that youngest brother they were small, but they were very strong. They were very mighty warriors. And that's the tribe that almost got wiped off of the face of the earth by all the rest of the tribes, because in the land of Benjamin that the priest's concubine had been raped. So then they came back and almost completely wiped out the tribe of Benjamin. It says that Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, devouring his enemies in the morning and dividing his plunder in the evening. So it describes that way. And then remember, we have Joseph, and Joseph's allotment was split up amongst his two sons, his two eldest sons that were born in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh. As we track the tribes that come from Jacob, as we track them through our history into our future, we start in Genesis 29:31 through chapter 30, verse 24. You see we have the actual sons of Jacob here. We have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And we see that there's no Manasseh or Ephraim here, because they weren't actually sons of Jacob. Joseph was a son of Jacob. And then we have this 400-year span that they were in Egypt. And remember that Jacob had adopted Joseph's sons as his own sons in place of Joseph. Okay, so Joseph basically got like a double portion, basically. And that double portion was split up between his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. When we come to how they're marching through the desert in Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 through 28, Ephraim and Manasseh has replaced Joseph. There's no tribe of Joseph. Well, actually there is. It's just split up into two. Then you have Benjamin, Dan, and Asher. This is the way they marched through the desert. Remember, Levi at this point had been redeemed. God had redeemed the entire tribe of Levi in place of the firstborn sons. So instead of all the tribes giving up their firstborn, God chose the tribe of Levi to be redeemed, and then the tribe of Levi was split up into three separate clans, which was Gershon and Merari, which carried the tabernacle, and then you had the Kohathites, who carried the articles that went in the tabernacle. Levi is now divided and split up already as a precursor to when they got into the promised land. They actually wouldn't have any land. Okay, so when we fast forward to Joshua chapter 13 verse through 19, we remember that we had 2.5 tribes that remained on the east side of the Jordan. That was Reuben and Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh. And then over on the west side of the Jordan, which was the actual promised land over there, you had the tribe of Judah, the other half of the tribe of Manasseh, Ephraim, Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. So in all, including these two halves, you had 12 tribes here, because you have Ephraim and Manasseh now that are counted as two separate tribes. And there in the original land allotments, as we said earlier, that Levi actually had no land allotted to them. So you actually had 13. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plus the 1. So you actually had 13 tribes going on right there in Joshua while they were occupying the promised land and thereafter. And now we have this prophecy that we just read this week in Ezekiel 48 verses 1 through 29, and it's talking about at some point the land of Israel will be divided up again according to the tribes of Israel, but not like it was before. Last time those allotments went off of mountain ranges and rivers and valleys as defining lines between one tribal land or another. This time they work in this passage in Ezekiel 48. It works in straight east and west lines running from the Jordan River all the way over to the Mediterranean. And it goes in this order: Dan in the north, Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh working their way south, Manasseh and Ephraim, and then Reuben. Then Levi actually has an allotted tribal land. Then you have Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, and Gad. So Joseph isn't reclaimed back in there. Joseph still gets his double portion, but Levi gets their land back in the future in Ezekiel 48. You might think that this is similar to the passage in Revelation 21, which tells us something very similar. But notice in Ezekiel 48, there's a temple, and in Revelation 21, there is no temple. So we know that Revelation 21, that passage takes place during the New Heavens, New Earth period. Moving on with our narrative here, we'll go back, refocus on Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews that are exiled in Babylon. So there's no record of any activities of Nebuchadnezzar between 582 and 575 BC. There's a 7-year period there in the Babylonian historical record where there's no activities of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you look back to the last 16 years that we've been reading, he's been a very busy guy. He's been passing lots of laws, he's been attacking, laying siege, putting up little puppet kings, and Judah is not the only place that he's dealing with. He's dealing with the entire Babylonian Empire, which reached all the way down into Egypt, upper Ethiopia, all the way back down into modern-day Kuwait through Iraq. So he's a really busy guy, and then all of a sudden there's this blank space where there's no history recorded in the Babylonian record about Nebuchadnezzar. And this could have been due to this period that we read about in Daniel chapter 4. So Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, as he does, and that tells us also, how God said that he was going to work with Nebuchadnezzar and use Nebuchadnezzar as his tool to punish Judah. And so God is giving all this revelation, all these things to Nebuchadnezzar, and now Nebuchadnezzar realizes he needs Daniel to interpret these dreams and interpret these visions he's having. So we're going to fast forward to Daniel chapter 4, verse 24. So he has this dream when Daniel explains it. This is Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar. This is what the dream means. Your Majesty, and what the Most High has declared will happen to my lord the king. You will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. So you have that 7 years, that 7 years of blank history in the Babylonian record, and where Daniel is telling him there's going to be 7 periods of time, 7 years, they're going to pass until he realizes that the God of Daniel, the God of the Jews, rules over all the kingdoms. God is actually humbling Nebuchadnezzar here. And it says, he rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and roots of the tree were left in the ground. This means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. And King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Daniel's talking to him. He says, stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. So Daniel's telling him straight up what he needs to do. He's telling him what his dream was. He's telling him what his dream meant. And as we go on in chapter 4, start at verse 28, it says, but all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. So 12 months later, after Daniel had interpreted his dream, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. As he looked out across the city, he said, look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor. Now, 12 months earlier, Daniel had told him, he said, stop sinning, break away from your wicked past, be merciful to the poor. He says, what God's trying to tell you is that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. And he had chose to give all this power to Nebuchadnezzar. And now Nebuchadnezzar, 12 months later, is now walking on the roof and he's saying, look at all the things I have done by my power. And if you watched last week's video, that sounds a lot like somebody else who said, I want to be like the Most High. I want to have all this dominion that is mine, and I did it by my power instead of my dependence on you, God. And God detests that attitude, and He detests that way of thinking. So what happens? It says, verse 31, while these words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven and said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone He chooses. Verse 33, that same hour the judgment was fulfilled and Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven. He lived this way until his hair was as long as eagle's feathers and his nails were like bird's claws. And this is actually like a documented mental illness now, where people think that they're animals. I think they call it lycanthropy, where people actually think that they are animals, and they resemble all the characteristics of that. I mean, as much as a human can possibly exhibit. Daniel chapter 4, after this time has passed, and this is Nebuchadnezzar is now talking in the book of Daniel. I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, my sanity returned, and I praised and worshipped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting, His kingdom is eternal. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to Him. He does as He pleases among the angels of the heavens and among the people of the earth. No one can stop Him or say to Him, what do you mean by doing these things? So Nebuchadnezzar humbles himself after these 7 years. He looks up and is returned to his regular consciousness. Verse 36, Nebuchadnezzar says, when my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom, with even greater honor than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All His acts are just and true, and He is able to humble the proud. So Nebuchadnezzar here was humbled because he was exhibiting that same rebellious characteristics that Satan had all those millennia before. God really detests that aptitude that we have to follow in Satan's path and search for autonomy from God. He wants us to be dependent on Him and to serve Him, acknowledge Him as sovereign. And it's a really easy thing to do, but you have to get over that thing called pride to do that. And that pride thing, that doesn't come from God, that comes from the other fellow. And we talked about that last week. In Ezekiel 40, we get a glimpse of a future temple. And you should note here that this temple that's described here is much too large to be a constructed temple in any of our past. This is a temple of the future, possibly of the millennial reign of Christ in our future. So let's review this history of the temples on the Temple Mount. Okay, so we're talking about Mount Moriah as the location, right? And this was the place where Abraham had gone long before there was a temple, long before there was a Jerusalem, long before there was a tribal allotment of Judah. Abraham had gone to sacrifice Isaac, and then he was provided a ram and did not do that, and therefore all the lineage of the people of Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob all come from Isaac. Also, it was the place probably where Melchizedek served as both the king and the priest of the Most High. And remember, in previous lessons, we looked at a video where they think that they found possibly the altar, the place where Melchizedek may have made sacrifices to God in a pre-Abrahamic world. That's where we start at over here. And then fast forward, after the Jews move into the Promised Land, initially the tabernacle was set up at Shiloh, and then eventually King David came to power. After Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines, the ark eventually made its way to the city of David, and which is basically on the foothills of Mount Moriah. And then he selected the place to build a temple that was on top of Mount Moriah, and it was on a threshing floor. Okay, so then his son in 966 BC, his name was Solomon, King Solomon, built the first temple in 966 BC. That temple continued on for 380 years. So all the way through the divided kingdom era, because remember Solomon passes away and the kingdom is divided soon after that, and then you go through 380 years, close to 400 years of division, and finally Nebuchadnezzar comes in 586 BC and he destroys that temple. So that was Solomon's temple, and it's destroyed in 586 BC. And we're about to read, or we have read this week, where they return. Babylon comes under the reign of the Medes and the Persians, and then King Cyrus allows them to go back with Zerubbabel as their leader, and they rebuild the temple in 515 BC. So this is our second temple. And then in 498 years later, in the time of Jesus, Herod the Great, which is the one that slew all the children in Bethlehem trying to kill Jesus. In 17 BC, Herod the Great renovates and enlarges this temple that Zerubbabel built when they came back from Babylon. All right. So then we have the time of Jesus, which is, this is the second temple era. So we have the first temple era, the second temple era. Then we have 53-year span. After Herod the Great renovates that temple, we have 53-year span, and then that second temple is destroyed in 70 AD by the Roman general Titus. It's completely destroyed, and then it serves as a place for a few Romans that set up shrines there to themselves or to Roman gods there. And then 621 years later, in 691 AD, the Caliph Abd al-Malik actually decides that's where he's going to build the Dome of the Rock, which is what is there today. So we're living during this era right here where the Dome of the Rock sits on top of the place where Solomon's temple was built. And it was built in 691 AD. Okay, so we're talking about something that was originally selected and built back in 966 BC. The Caliph didn't build it until build the Dome of the Rock until 691 AD. So long time, but see, this place where the temple was built is highly sought after. Move forward in time, we don't know how much time is going to go past, but then eventually we know that there will be a third temple. And we're speculating that Ezekiel, this temple that's described here in this week's reading in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, is perhaps this third temple, which is a lot bigger than these previous temples. Okay, and I don't know what's going to happen to the Dome of the Rock. I don't know how that'll play out in our future. That's why the question mark is there. But at some point there will be a third temple built here on the same spot. And then we fast forward, we don't know how long this takes place. That third temple stays on earth, but we know that we'll be doing sacrifices because the Antichrist will come in and he will abolish the daily sacrifice. And we know that's how we know there's going to be a third temple, is because if the Antichrist is going to abolish the daily sacrifice, then there has to be a temple for them to be making the sacrifices at. And then we fast forward back to Revelation 21, 22 with the new heavens and new earth. When he describes the city of Jerusalem, there is no temple in it. The Lord serves as the temple himself. There is no actual temple there. So that tells me that this temple that's described in Ezekiel 40 through 48 is this third temple that's going to be built in our future. So after we get through that portion of Ezekiel where we're talking about this temple, which is probably the third temple, the future only knows, we get to Ezekiel 43 and we see how the Lord's glory returns to the temple. And this might actually be the Messiah during the millennial reign after the Antichrist is defeated. Ezekiel 43 says, verse 2, we'll start at verse 2. Suddenly the glory of the God of Israel appeared from the east. The sound of his coming was like the roar of rushing waters, and the whole landscape shone with his glory. Okay, so if you'll notice, most Christian graveyards, I would say almost 99% of them face east. And that's because of passages like this where it says that Jesus will return, the Messiah will come from the east. This portion here says the glory of the God of Israel will appear in the east. Now remember, when the glory of God departed from the temple, earlier passages in Ezekiel chapter 11, the glory of God left the temple area, went across the Kidron Valley, and rested above the Mount of Olives. Okay? And remember, we talked about the Mount of Olives being the place where Jesus ascended into heaven in his body that had holes in his hands or his wrists and his feet. So in that spot, that's a very special place over the Mount of Olives, which is east of the temple area. There's some significance about this coming from the east. It says the glory of the Lord that had departed in Ezekiel 11 returns back from the east, from the Mount of Olives. He says, I fell face down on the ground. The glory of the Lord came into the temple through the east gateway. So we see the glory of the Lord return to the temple there. And this probably is this third temple that we're talking about here. Ezekiel was prophesying about the glory of the Lord departing from the temple during the first temple era, and now it seems the glory of the Lord doesn't return to the temple area until the third temple, and the third temple isn't built yet. This is in our future. In verse 5 it says, the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner courtyard, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and I heard someone speaking to me from within the temple, while the man who had been measuring stood beside me. Ezekiel, throughout this entire vision, has been accompanied by this angel who's been with him. And this takes place in his vision right after the description of this temple, this really big temple that we just talked about. That tells me that this temple with the glory returning isn't the second temple that Zerubbabel built that was there during the time of Jesus. It's not the expanded temple that Herod constructed. This is a future temple. This is some temple that will be built in our future. And if you haven't been following much news, I may have said this earlier in the study, but there is a movement in Israel where they are collecting the things that they will need to consecrate the priests, Levites, the priests, and to build a new temple so they can go back into worshiping the way that they used to. And we know these things have to happen for the Lord to return, as was prophesied. So we know that the temple has to be built. The Antichrist will war with Israel. The Antichrist will sit in the temple, call himself God. He will abolish the daily sacrifice. And then at that point, Jesus will return. And then there'll be the little war. Possibly the first battle of Gog and Magog that was in Ezekiel that we talked about earlier. And Satan will then be locked away into the abyss, the bottomless pit, while the beast and the false prophet are thrown into hell. And then after that millennial reign, after 1,000 years of Christ reigning on earth as king in Jerusalem, Satan will be let loose for a short time. And that's where we have that second battle of Gog and Magog that took place in Revelation 21. And then that's a short battle. The fire from heaven comes down, obliterates Satan's army, and then that's what brings about the new heavens and new earth. And then that is that last city of God that is talked about there in Revelation 21, where there is no temple there. So there's big difference between the temple that's in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 and the city of Jerusalem in the new heavens, new earth in Revelation 21. Don't get the two mixed up.